The basis of this system started with Final Fantasy XIII's attack chain system, where chaining different types of attacks and exploiting enemy weaknesses raised the enemy stagger gauge. Once full, the enemy would take an increased amount of damage until the gauge depleted. The gauge depleted faster or slower depending on the types of attacks used. Enemies could be staggered quickly if nuked with magics, but the stagger would last only a short time, so it was important to use physical attacks to slow the gauge's depletion. In Final Fantasy XV, striking different parts of enemies would cause a break status, which would weaken those areas, stun enemies, and sometimes completely immobilize them. Positioning is also a key factor in avoiding attacks, as well as inflicting them. Attacking from behind or to where the enemy is weak would trigger blindsides. Final Fantasy VII Remake's pressure and stagger system is a combination of both of these systems, finding weaknesses in the enemy, focusing attacks on certain parts, and using the right attacks to stagger the enemy whilst also being aware of your positioning. The system has the in-battle alternative win conditions of Final Fantasy XIII, as well as the benefits of Final Fantasy XV's free battle, with the immediacy of a real-time combat system. It's important to know the basic actions with Cloud, as well as the flow of combat before talking about the pressure and stagger system, as each element goes hand in hand. By hitting enemies, you build pressure, or heat as it's known in the Japanese version, and is shown as an orange bar underneath the enemy's health. This increases as you attack them. Each enemy's pressure gauge fills differently, but once it gets to a certain point, or if the enemy is hit with certain attacks, they enter the pressurized state. Pressured enemies will take an increased amount of pressure from your attacks, meaning now is the time to use your attacks to max it out. For Cloud, his go-to ability is Focused Thrust, which increases pressure by a huge amount when the enemy feels pressured. The goal being to get it to max, and once you do, the enemy is then staggered. Called Burst in the Japanese version, Stagger immobilizes the enemy, and attack damage is now multiplied by 160% at base, meaning your attacks now do 2.5 times the normal amount. Now is the time to use your huge damage abilities and magics to finish off the enemy. The orange pressure gauge decreases at a different rate for each enemy while staggered, so it's important to remember which enemies have long and short stagger windows to make the most of the multiplier. You might have noticed from the ATB chapter that Cloud's Punisher combo generated more ATB whilst the Huntsman was staggered. Cloud is now able to perform an ability after a full combo, as it now generates enough ATB to be self-sufficient.